"I'll give you my salary if you translate this," the millionaire boss laughed. But the cleaning lady silenced him. She arrived before the rest of the world woke up. She moved through the company's dark hallways as if she already knew the way, because she did. Every day she was the one who prepared the space that everyone else merely used. She swept the floors, arranged the chairs, put the coffee on, and then vanished. Lucia Valenti. That was the name nobody remembered. That morning it all started with a broken glass. The conference room was still empty. Lucia stepped in to pick up something someone had left behind. The glass slipped off the tray and shattered with a sharp crack. She bent down immediately to clean it up. But before she could gather all the shards, the door swung open. In walked him, Elio Mura, partner at the consulting firm. Arrogant, too quick to listen. His suit cost more than half the team's salary. His voice cut through the silence before he even entered the room. "Can you do this later?" He said it without meeting her eyes, as if he were asking someone to move a traffic cone. Then he added, louder, crueler. "A company that charges $12,000 per square meter, and we've got to dodge the cleaning lady." Someone laughed. Someone looked down, but nobody spoke up. Lucia didn't answer. She swept up the shards, stood slowly, and walked out in silence. But not all silence is empty. Sometimes silence is where dignity hides, and in that moment, hidden behind her steady posture and downcast eyes, was a story nobody there knew. Later, when the team went out for coffee, Elio left his reports scattered in the meeting room. Spreadsheets, charts, projections. Those pages meant money, at least to him. Lucia returned to clean up. She glanced at the papers as if just checking where not to touch. But something caught her eye. A number. Wrong. Simple. But it would have cost a fortune if it reached the client. She grabbed a pencil, drew a small circle around the mistake, and wrote, right in the footer, "Incorrect projection, review second quarter base index," signed with her initials, LV. She folded the sheet, slipped it under the folder, and left. No noise, no witnesses, no credit. At the next meeting, Elio would open the report, see the note, and snap, "Who's LV?" No one would know. But on the other side of the story, whoever was listening would, and they'd understand that Lucia Valenti wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was someone who, even in silence, had already begun to change everything. Elio Mura's desk was a battlefield. Contracts, spreadsheets, printed emails, all piled up like armor against chaos. But that morning, a different envelope arrived. Stiff paper, international seal, sender from Hungary. He didn't even blink. He opened it with one hand and shrugged when he realized he didn't understand a word. Pages and pages in Hungarian. A language to him just a bunch of incomprehensible squiggles. He held the envelope up and joked, "If anyone here translates this, they get my salary this month." Laughter. Guffaws. Another one of his power lines tossed out just to remind people who he was. Then came a voice that shouldn't have belonged there, soft, unhurried, without a challenge. "I can give it a try." Everyone froze. Lucia stood in the doorway, her uniform still damp from cleaning, holding the squeegee in one hand, a rag in the other. No smile, no tremor. Silence. Someone whispered. Someone snickered under their breath. Elio crossed his arms. "You speak Hungarian?" "Yes. I speak, read, and write it," she answered, as casually as if she'd said, "There's coffee in the carafe." He threw the papers on the desk. "Be my guest." No one expected anything, but what happened in the next few minutes turned the room inside out. Lucia read, page after page, fluently, with rhythm, using technical vocabulary nobody else in the room could even pronounce. At the end, she looked up and said, "You're the direct heir to an estate registered in Budapest, almost 16 million euros. But there are clauses. The window to contest secondary heirs closes in 12 business days. If no action is taken by then, the funds revert to the Hungarian government. Absolute silence. Elio didn't move, didn't blink. Someone he'd barely considered human minutes before had just saved the biggest financial opportunity of his life. And what stung most was not knowing how. "Who are you?" he finally asked. Lucia simply gathered the sheets, aligned the edges, and replied without meeting his eyes, "Just someone who still reads what nobody else wants to see," and walked away. No fanfare, no sudden celebrity, unaware that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, Elio spent the entire morning staring at the cleaning room door, waiting for her. It wasn't curiosity, it was unease. He needed to understand who this woman was, someone who spoke legal Hungarian as naturally as she emptied a trash bag. When he finally saw her pass by with the cart, he called her over, not like he was giving an order, but like he was asking a question he couldn't put into words. "Lucia, you've got a minute?" She stopped, looked at him, nodded once reservedly, and stepped inside. Elio offered a chair. She stayed standing. He got straight to the point. "Yesterday you translated documents that not even my lawyer could have understood. Now I need to know. Who are you?" Lucia was silent for a few seconds, not out of fear, but because she'd learned over time that telling your own story isn't always a relief. That day, though, she told it. She'd been a university professor for 11 years, a linguistics specialist, fluent in 4 languages, published papers, translated international contracts, a leading academic until the day she decided to do what nobody else would. She blew the whistle on embezzled funds, refused to be bribed, made noise where everyone else pretended not to hear. She was suspended, sued, erased. After that, nobody would hire me. Not as a professor or a translator. I became a risk. And when you're a woman and poor and refuse to be silent, the world shuts its doors without leaving a trace. Cleaning was the only door left ajar. Elio listened in silence, and for the first time, he didn't know what to say. The woman he'd humiliated in front of his colleagues had more education than he did, more courage, and more dignity than anyone in that building. But she didn't tell her story out of anger or pity. She told it as if saying, "You asked, I answered." Elio stood up. He wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. "Why are you still here?" he asked. Lucia looked him in the eye for the first time. "Because my daughter still dreams of becoming a doctor, and because dignity doesn't depend on the badge you wear." Silence. In that moment, Elio realized he had a bigger problem than an international inheritance. He needed the help of someone he'd learned to ignore, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure she'd help him. 2 tickets, 1 destination. Elio never imagined he'd share an international flight with a cleaning lady, and Lucia never thought she'd return to Europe as the key player in a multi-million-dollar case. But there they were, side by side, on the same flight with the same mission, reclaim an inheritance and maybe a bit of themselves. The flight lasted over 12 hours, but the silence between them didn't last as long as Elio expected. He began to listen, truly listen, and discovered that Lucia knew things nobody on his entire team did. She understood contracts, international law, people, and the more she spoke, the more Elio realized that, deep down, he'd never learned how to hear. Arriving in Budapest, the challenges began immediately. The will was legitimate, yes, but the process was mired in red tape. There were distant heirs contesting, ambiguous clauses, deadlines that almost nobody understood. Almost. Lucia read everything like it was an old letter. She translated, argued, pointed out flaws, corrected the lawyers, and led meetings as if she did this every day. In one session with the Hungarian judge, Elio understood maybe half of what was said. But he saw the lawyers' faces shift when Lucia spoke. Steady, clear, without asking permission to exist. She was the one saving everything, not just the documents, but the dignity he didn't even know he'd lost. On the final day of the trip, while they waited for the court's final word, Elio broke the silence with a sentence that sounded like it had been stuck in his throat for years. "I was wrong about you." Lucia looked at him, didn't smile, didn't answer right away. She simply said, "We all make mistakes. What matters is what you do afterward." The next morning, the decision came through. The inheritance was secured, nearly 16 million euros, a fortune that would change Elio's life. But what he hadn't expected was something else, the uneasy feeling that the money wasn't the most valuable thing he'd gained there. On the flight home, Lucia slept peacefully for the first time in days. Elio stayed awake, because, for the first time in years, he had a lot to think about and a lot to change. Back in Brazil, Elio arrived at the office carrying more than an inheritance. He carried a nagging discomfort, an awakened conscience, and a debt no amount of money could ever repay. 2 days passed, then 2 more. He couldn't sleep well. Everything he saw, the meetings, the speeches, the flattery, now sounded like echoes of a world he'd helped build, but could no longer respect. On the following Monday morning, he called the whole operation to a halt, cancelled all meetings, called an all-hands assembly, sent word that everyone must be in the company auditorium, without exception. At 9 a.m. sharp, the room was packed. No one knew why. Rumors started swirling. A promotion, a sale, layoffs. Elio walked onto the stage holding an envelope, his face heavy. He didn't look like the same man who'd humiliated Lucia just days before. He took a deep breath and began. "In recent years, I got used to thinking results were everything, that success meant profit, and that people were merely pieces, some replaceable, others invisible. I was wrong. And today, I'm here to do something I should have done a long time ago." Silence. No phones, no whispers. Elio went on. "A few days ago, I received a multi-million euro inheritance, and I only didn't lose it all because of an employee most of you never noticed. I humiliated her, ignored her, ridiculed her, and yet she saved me." He pointed toward the back of the auditorium. Everyone turned. There stood Lucia Valente, in her blue uniform, hands folded, expressionless. This is Lucia Valente. And as of today, she won't be carrying buckets or rags anymore. She'll be carrying ideas, decisions, and projects. Applause, not at first. People didn't know they could. But then the first clap came, then the second, and soon the whole auditorium was on its feet. Some embarrassed, others in awe, all of them wondering, how did we never see this woman? Lucia walked to the stage. Elio handed her the envelope with her official appointment as Director of International Projects. She took it with steady hands, didn't cry, didn't beam. She simply said, "Thank you, not for the promotion, but for finally seeing me." That was it. But it was enough. There, in the very room where she once swept the floors, she now stood to a standing ovation, and not out of pity, but out of merit. That day, something changed in the company, and it wasn't just her title. It was the silence that was broken. It was the culture that blushed. It was the respect that finally began. Lucia Valente's life changed, but she didn't. Her new position came with a new badge, a new office, a new salary. But she still arrived early, greeted everyone by name, and had lunch with the interns like she'd always been there. Only now, she was seen, heard, and above all, respected. While the company was changing on the outside, a much deeper change was happening inside her home. Taina, her daughter, the girl who studied from borrowed workbooks, who did summaries by flashlight, who believed in the impossible. now had the peace to focus. Now she could study with dignity. Now she saw her mother being valued, and that told her, without words, it's possible. On the morning of the college entrance results, Lucia didn't sleep. She made coffee, waited in silence. Tainar opened the website, eyes wide, hand over her mouth. She couldn't speak. Lucia read it out loud. First place, Medicine University of São Paulo. There were no words in that moment, just a hug, long, tight, wet with tears. For years, Lucia had cleaned corridors, dreaming that her daughter would walk down others, hospital halls, lecture rooms, library aisles. That day, that dream stopped being hope and became a path. Days later, Elio heard the news. He called Lucia into his office. He held an envelope. It's a scholarship for Tainar. Not as a favor, but as an investment. I want her never to worry about anything but her studies. Lucia hesitated, nearly refused, but he said something that sealed the gesture with honesty. When you changed my life, you asked for nothing. Now it's my turn to do the right thing. Because sometimes truly saying thank you is making sure the cycle of injustice ends in your generation. She accepted. On her way out, she passed a new hire who looked at her with admiration. The girl whispered, "You're an inspiration. Thank you for being here." Lucia didn't respond with a speech. She just smiled. Because at that moment she understood something money can't buy. She hadn't just changed roles. She'd changed her place in history and brought a lot of people along with her. Time passed. But in Lucia's director's office, time ran differently. There was no luxury. The desk was simple, the chair comfortable but unassuming, books piled in one corner, and a yellowed note framed on the wall, a dedication, handwritten by a student from another era, before the dismissal, before the cleaning job, before everything. Professor Lucia, thank you for making me believe I could. One day, I'll call you colleague. She looked at it now and then, not out of nostalgia, but to remind herself that what was erased could still be rewritten. In the breaks, Lucia walked through the building like before. But now, people stopped her, smiled, asked how she was, listened. It was as if the company had finally learned to walk with its eyes open. Outside, Tainar was starting university life, hair tied back, white coat on, eyes shining with fear and courage. The girl who studied among brooms now studied among scalpels, and whenever she could, she texted her mother, "Today we had dissection." I almost fainted, but I remembered you, so I kept going. Lucia would laugh and cry at the same time. One quiet afternoon, Elio walked into her office without knocking. He held a manila envelope. "I'm not here for business. I found this among some old papers. It's yours." She opened it. It was a letter. A copy of the letter Lucia had written years ago to the university dean, denouncing the embezzlement. The letter that almost ruined her career, and that now returned as the symbol of everything that began there. She said nothing. She tucked the letter away, looked out the window. Below, employees were leaving for the day. Someone was playing with a dog. Someone was sharing a pack of cookies. And Lucia felt something she hadn't felt in a very, very long time. Silence, but a good silence. The kind called peace. This story didn't end with applause or headlines. It ended like real life does, with respect, with justice, with space. If you ever pass someone and see nothing but a uniform, remember Lucia. Sometimes the company's greatest talent is still holding a bucket. And the biggest mistake is not noticing.